Hello, welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is the Great Big History Podcast. In this episode of 10 Questions, we do the Byzantine Empire. Don't call it a comeback. I've been here for years. Why? Because of how the Byzantines saw themselves. Who were they? They're actually not the Byzantines. They're the Eastern Roman Empire. And they thought of themselves as Roman, as Rome, and the Turks who call them Rum, their version of Rome. In fact, Constantinople wasn't Constantinople, it was New Rome. So they saw themselves as the Eastern Roman Empire. And it's not only that they saw themselves that, they were that. The West fell. 476 is the last Roman emperor in Italy, but there's a Roman emperor in Constantinople doing just fine. Sure, the Goths ran through Greece, wrecked some places, but you're going to need some time to recover. But Constantinople, the giant walls of Constantinople protected Asia Minor from invasion, protected the Levant, protected Egypt. So there's an entire half of the Eastern Roman Empire that is an inheritor of Greek and Roman culture, knowledge, and institutions. The fall of the West, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, that's all seen as a humiliation. It's an embarrassment. How could these people overrun half the Roman Empire? Maybe we have to get it back. We should get it back. How can we let these people take over our empire? And how did the Byzantines see themselves? Well, why did they see themselves this way? Well, they have a Christian capital, Constantinople, which had 600,000 people in it, which is probably more than all of the Goths that invaded the Roman Empire. They have a Roman Christian emperor who can claim legitimacy all the way back to Constantine. They have infantry legions and a navy, and they have long-distance trade over maintained roads. Roman civilization continues. Now, most of the people in the East speak Greek because they always spoke Greek from the time of Alexander's conquest. Education was done in Greek. Educated Romans knew Latin and Greek. So there's several emperors who are trying to put the house in order, fix things up, and that brings us to Justinian. Justinian, from 527 to 565, the empire strikes back. Justinian saw himself as a Roman emperor. And this is why historians like Justinian. Justinian is a favorite for historians. Why? Because he looks like a Roman emperor. He acts like a Roman emperor. He's got the swagger of a Roman emperor, at least after his wife, Theodosia, put some steel in his spine. He spoke Latin. He's probably the last emperor to speak Latin. He was a Christian, which is important because all Roman emperors are Christian after Constantine. There is one who tries to go back to the old gods. It didn't work. He warred against Gothic barbarians in Spain and Italy and in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe. He builds big things. The Hagia Sophia. Now, can a Roman emperor who's a Christian build a Colosseum and murder people in it? No. So what are the big things he's going to build? He's going to build Christian stuff. So Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, is the largest Christian church in the world. Until it's taken over by the Turks in 1453 and turned into the largest mosque in the world. Now that is an embarrassment, so that the Pope in Rome can't have the biggest church in the world be a mosque. So he starts building St. Peter's Basilica, which is going to be so big and cost so much money that it causes Martin Luther to start the Protestant Reformation, because he has a lot of objections to how the Pope, using indulgences, wants to pay for the building of St. Peter's, which means if you are a Protestant, you exist because 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, Justinian built the church. Massive church. He reformed the laws, the Corpus Juris Civilis. See, for 300 years, nobody was minding the store. No one. Roman emperors do a couple of things, right? They build big things, they beat up barbarians, and they do the law. They maintain the law. Romans and the law. Well, for 300 years, the law was a mess. Why? Because you had the 3rd century crisis, then you had the invasions from the Goths and the Germans, then you had the collapse of the West, then you had recovery. There wasn't any time to sit down and go, what are the laws? There was lots of laws. And they didn't correspond with each other because times had changed. Situations has changed. So a lot of the law was emergency stuff. So they sat down and got, what is the law? And they edited out something like 1 million lines of code. So for the libertarians out there, this is a big moment because this is efficiency. You're getting rid of government bloat. You're cutting things out, right? This is good. He brought the smartest scholars together. He brought archives of Roman law together and figured out what's the real law. And later, when the Western Crusaders come through Constantinople, they're going to pick that up and they're going to bring it back because Roman law was forgotten in the West. It's Justinian's law that they're going to bring back and then becomes the basis for the major ways Europe is going to do things. Now, there's things in the Corpus Juris Civilis like slavery they're going to cut out eventually, but it's the formation of law codes. So what was Justinian's desire? Well, if you're on the video and you're looking, he started with the green, and when he ends, he has the green and the purple. And that purple's a nice purple because that's the purple of royalty, of kings. What he wants is to reunite the Roman Empire. That's what he wants to do. The Gothic Germanic conquest of the West is an embarrassment. In fact, he's a Roman emperor who doesn't own Rome. So what does he want to do? He wants to own Rome. And so with the help of his courtesan wife Theodora and his general Belisarius, he's going to set out and fight for basically the 20 years of his reign. Reunite the Roman Empire. Now, Belisarius is like Justinian. If Justinian is the last of the Roman emperors, Belisarius had the reputation of being the last of the, quote, Romans. He's the best general since Constantine. And he's famous for his victories. He's not famous as a general anymore. He's kind of been forgotten because the Byzantines are kind of forgotten. The Western Europeans kind of abandoned the Byzantines. They stopped thinking of them as European. They definitely don't think about them as Roman because when you take a class and it says, when did the Roman Empire fall? It's 476. Even though Edward Gibbon, who writes the definitive history, it's like whatever it is, 6 volumes, 10 volumes, that is the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, goes to 1453. He doesn't stop in 476. Edward Gibbon has Justinian. He has the Basils. And so Belisarius is famous for doing more with less. He didn't show up with 100,000 troops, 1,000 ships, and conquer places. He showed up with 10,000 troops at the end of a long supply route and still won. He even recaptured Rome. So again, by the death of Justinian, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic in Spain and Gibraltar to the Euphrates. He had recaptured Rome, Sicily, Carthage, and North Africa, and even southern and eastern Spain. So again, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. A couple of good successors, a couple of some stable time. And hey, Rome wasn't built in a day, but we're on the way to recreating a Roman Empire, a reuniting a Roman Empire. So the question begets, why didn't the Byzantines recreate the Roman Empire after Justinian's death? He set them up. He got Sicily back. He got Italy back. He got Rome back. The Byzantine Empire is again the greatest civilization in the world. Why didn't they recreate the Roman Empire? Well, a couple of bad things happened. They needed nothing bad to happen, and bad things happened. And this is going to be kind of the theme of the Byzantines. Like, the Byzantine chapter hurts me to teach. Not physically, but it hurts in they keep coming so close. It could have been. The world could have been different in a lot of ways. The Byzantines didn't have to fail. But just on the edges of doing some great things, bad things happen. And one of those is a giant plague comes out of the east, following the Silk Road. And it's called Justinian's plague, and it will kill 25% of the urban population. That hurt Persia. That hurt the Byzantines. It didn't hurt the Arabs, because the Arabs are nomadic horse people. It didn't hurt Western Europe as much, because they didn't live in cities anymore. The German and the Goths didn't live in cities. So Justinian's plague hurt their ability. Right? Imagine if 25% of the people died, right? Look at the trauma of COVID, and that's less than 1% of people. Imagine if 25% of people died. That's how much money in taxation is lost. How much less people for the military. How much less workers. What happens to prices? What happens to inflation? What happens to education? Right? If 25%, if 1 in 4 of your teachers are dead, who's teaching? Right? And so, first is this plague that wiped out much of the urban population. Second thing is, the Dark Ages of the West has begun. It's the end of cities. It's the end of a major tax base. It's the end of places to anchor the empire. Even Rome was effectively useless. Rome, they capture Rome. It's a city of like 5,000 people now. It's not Rome, 1 million people. So there's just less places to like plant the flag and hold, to save. There's less people who call themselves Roman. There's just less of them. There's less people who think of themselves as Roman. Italy, France, Spain are converting into the Middle Ages, into what will become the people who will speak Italian and French and Spanish. The British are completely gone. The British are conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. They are not even Christian anymore. They completely lost Christianity. Like, the British are gone. And so there's just no educated people left in Western Europe to help you. Though the educated people that are left are essentially the priests. And they don't necessarily want to help a Byzantine emperor. They got their own things going on. They want to spread Christianity, yeah, but they don't want the Byzantine emperor to tell them how to do that. So with the West collapsing into this dark age, and with the less population to use as colonists, the West is just harder to hold on to. Now, if you had peace, you might be able to do that, but the problem is Sassanid Persia is an existential threat. The Sassanid Persians believe themselves to be the new Achaemenids. They are the new Cyrus Part 2. And so they want to conquer the Middle East, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Constantinople. And in 636, they lay siege to Constantinople. The Byzantines are done. It looks awful. It looks like they're done. And the Emperor Heraclius kind of does a Hail Mary. He gets his army. He leaves them at Constantinople. He hopes that the big walls will protect Constantinople. Now, the Sassanids aren't barbarians. They got siege equipment. They have real legions. They have infantry and cavalry armies. They are the real deal. They can capture cities. And they've captured everything in the Middle East. Ctesiphon and Antioch. And so they look like, the Byzantine Empire looks like it's over in the East. It still owns Greece and southeastern Europe, but it looks like it's over. And what Heraclius does, the Emperor Heraclius, is does a Hail Mary. He takes his army, puts them on boats, sails them across the Black Sea to a little city called Trebizond, which the Persians hadn't bothered conquering because it's kind of isolated way in the corner of the Black Sea. It's not on the way to Constantinople if you're going by land. And what he did was invade, get his army off, pick up mercenaries in Armenia, and then come down the Tigris and invade Mesopotamia, cross over and invade into Persia. He wins a stunning, complete victory. The Sassanid Empire is essentially ended. Middle East has been saved. Heraclius is the great conquering king. Obviously, the Byzantines can't absorb Persia, but Persia is no longer a threat. For 300 years, the Sassanid Persians, is one of the reasons Constantinople was built in the first place, have threatened the Eastern Roman Empire, and just as the things looked at their bleakest, Heraclius gets the big win. Okay, so that should have freed Heraclius or his successors up, go back to the West, right? Except something completely unforeseen happens. And that is Islamic armies erupt out of Arabia in the 630s and overwhelm the Middle East and overwhelm Persia. Islamic Arab armies on their horses come out. And what they do is make a lot of deals. They don't have to conquer. Like you go, wait a minute, these are nomadic horse people. How do they conquer big cities? A lot of these cities are welcome them in. They're tired of the 300 years of war. And so this series of bad things happen that keep the Byzantines from recreating the Roman Empire after Justinian's death. In fact, they had to deal with the near death during the Persian invasion, and now they got to deal with the Arabs and the Arab conquests. And in 717, what happened to the Byzantines is the Arabs laid siege to Constantinople. Having taken over Egypt, having taken over Mesopotamia, they broke into Asia Minor. They came over the mountains, broke into Asia Minor, and moved all the way through the cities of Asia Minor to Constantinople. And they laid siege with 100,000 men and 1,000 ships. This is a real siege. This is meant to end the Byzantine Empire. It's in the Quran. This is one of the great goals in the Quran, is to capture Rum, R-U-M. Constantinople. This is the near death of the Roman Empire. So why doesn't it die? Well, there's the last invention of Roman science. And if you're watching the video, you know what it is. You may not know what it's called, but you know what you're looking at, and that is napalm. It is called Greek fire. It is medieval napalm. It's petrol-based, it's petroleum-based, so it burns everything, even water. It burns on top of water. So with Greek fire, it burns up the Arab ships. It burns up the navy. They drop it on these armies. This is, and you have to understand from the Arabs, they've never seen any of this. They don't have science. They're people from the desert. They're horse people from a desert. They haven't seen any of this in their entire lives. So this is like the flame of heaven, the anger of God being dropped on them. What water burns? What fire burns on top of water? This is also in Game of Thrones. If you ever watched the early seasons of Game of Thrones, this is Greek. It's not called Greek fire. It's called like wildfire. And it's the same thing. It burns on water. Now they make it a big explosion to make it sexier, but it burns everything. And so it's kind of apropos. It kind of makes sense that the last invention of Roman science is a weapon of war. Because the Romans, more than any other ancient people, were maybe the world's best warriors, best soldiers, best army at the time. And so it's kind of apropos, it's appropriate that the last invention of Roman science is a weapon of war. So what was the response? This glorious victory. They've beaten back. Constantinople saved. The Byzantines are saved. What is their response? Trauma. Their response is trauma. How could we almost lose? Why would the Christian God allow these people, these heretics, these people who call themselves Muslims, who say they worship the same God, but in a totally different way, how could our God, Jehovah, allow this to happen? And they looked around, and what they saw was medieval icons. They saw the Roman icons, like on the video of Christ Pantocrator, which I like to show because the reputation of Pantocrator is that it was painted by St. Luke, the writer of the gospel. So it's not every day you get to see a painting by a gospel writer, right? But here's the problem. To convert the Romans to Christianity, the Romans liked showing images of their gods. They liked sculpting. They liked painting. They liked the images of the gods. So if you wanted to convert them, St. Paul is very clear on this, you got to drop a lot of the rules that were Jewish rules. So that's no circumcision. That's you can eat pork. And you can, fine. But if you're going to draw a god, don't draw Jupiter, draw Jesus. And the Romans said, okay, that's not a problem. But there is a problem, and that problem is that the second commandment says, thou shalt have no graven images. You shouldn't produce images of God or religiously important people. And so everybody knows you're breaking the second commandment, but everybody lets it go. Well, here's the Muslims laying siege to Constantinople, and they looked around for an answer, and this was their answer. And so what the solution was conservatism. Destroy the icons, iconoclasm. Chop them up, burn them. A conservatism. The Byzantine Empire has to be more Christian than Roman, more insular than expansive. It needs to turn inward, more contemplative than inventive. It has to turn its back on its Roman identity and move into a medieval Christian identity. The biggest example of this is steam power. The Byzantines essentially figure out how to use steam for power, how to boil water, to use piping and create steam power. This is an invention that's not going to be used again in any major way for 1,000 years. and they're ahead. They could have had an industrial revolution. Do they? No. Because instead of using steam power for engines, for weapons of war, they use it for toys, like the tiki birds, the Toki Toki tiki birds, Disney World's tiki birds. Now that's impressive, right? Because the emperor is going to build a throne that he could raise up. He could push a button and a hydraulic lift, not hydraulic because that's liquid, that's water. You use the steam and you go up into the air and like, hi, I'm now 10 feet in the air. And it would scare people because they'd never seen anything like this before. And he had this he had a steam deck where he could push different buttons. And he's like, well, I'm going to make the birdies talk. And they'd be like, what birdies? And he'd like point to the birdies. And then they push the button and then the birdies would talk. And they're mechanical birdies. And like barbarians, Goths and Slavs and Germans would be like, oh my God, that's insane. You must be powerful. And it's impressive. But it's not power. It's not an engine. It doesn't help machines make the economy run. An engine that could turn a turbine to make power and electricity or whatever. That's not invented till the 1800s. And one reason why they don't go that way is this conservatism, this trauma from the Arab invasions. Now, so for about 100 years, you have this kind of stalemate. You have a conservative Byzantine, Greek, Christian society, traumatized by nearly being destroyed by the Arabs, and you have this stability. And then everything changes. New people start to show up. The Abbasids Caliphate is going to stop trying to conquer Constantinople. They're going to replace the Umayyads, who tried to conquer Constantinople. There's going to be a new Christian war in Spain because the Muslims, the Umayyads, will conquer Spain in 711. And so that part of the empire is lost. But there's a new Western Christian out of France, out of northern Spain, out of Portugal, that's going to start what's called the Reconquista and start fighting the Muslims in Spain. And then there's the Slavs who show up out of the forests of Eastern Europe. They push into Southeastern Europe. And these are the people who will become the Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Serbians, Romanians, Bulgarians, the Slavic peoples. And so they're pushing into the Byzantine Empire from the north. They're pushing into a new region that had been peaceful before. And so a new dynasty kind of shakes this off, this conservatism. It's still going to be conservative, but it's kind of like now it has to act. It can't be passive anymore. It's got to be active. And this is the kind of, we're still Romans. Like, we can still deal with this. And so that's Basil. And Basil's going to get a nickname, the Bulgar Slayer. So what does he accomplish? Well, you can understand what he accomplishes from his name. He's going to slay Bulgars. And what he does is defeat the Slavs to the north. In a series of wars, a series of battles, and through diplomatic uses of Christianity, the Hagia Sophia, he's able to defeat the Slavic invasions. And with the use of Roman Natio, remember, we still have that. He's able to convert the Slavs into Orthodox Christians. Make them allies. Now, the Byzantines are not strong enough to absorb the Slavs and make them into Byzantines, into Greek-speaking Roman citizens. They're not culturally strong enough this is the 900s. So 400 years after, 200 years, 150 years after the siege of Constantinople, 300 years after Justinian, The Byzantines are still impressive. They still got that Roman part, and their Christianity is very important and able to convert the Slavs from paganism, from polytheism to Christianity, but it's not able to make them Roman. It's not able to make them Byzantine. So they'll be allies from and occasionally competition, but at least they're in the same cultural orbit now. Basil will also turn around and push the Arabs back into Mesopotamia. He'll push them back over the mountains of Asia Minor and secure Asia Minor again for the Byzantines. So they secure the borders. Constantinople becomes the queen of cities. It becomes the center, the capital of Orthodox Christianity, and it becomes the center of culture and trade as the Abbasid Arabs build Baghdad and the Silk Road continues to hum. Constantinople becomes the place where Western, especially Italian, merchants go in order to buy goods from the East to sell to the West. So it becomes this kind of entrepot. It becomes this flea market in a way. Constantinople is both culturally the queen of cities and economically the most important city again in Europe. It's arguable whether it's the most important city in the world. Baghdad is at least as big, if not bigger, and it's closer on the Silk Road. But again, Constantinople comes back to being an impressive city. Basil rebuilds Byzantine greatness. So what happens? What happens is a new people show up, the Turks. So again, just at this moment of greatness, at where things in the north are stable, things in the east are stable, and hey, all right, you're not going to conquer the Arab Muslims anymore. You're not going to conquer the Middle East back. Maybe Egypt, possibly, maybe, but it's unlikely. But at least there's the stability. All we need is nothing bad to happen. Well, two bad things happen. The first is a series of weak successors to Basil. Basil dies, and what he leaves is his untrained daughters in charge. And we'll get to that in a moment. But the other thing that happens is a new people, a tough horse people from Central Asia show up. So who are the Turks? And they're the Turks because they speak what we call a Turkish language. So there's lots of Turks out there in Central Asia. In fact, one of the great changes that it happens, but we don't have history of it, is Central Asia goes from being Persian-speaking to Turkish-speaking. That doesn't mean everyone's united in one group. There are all kinds of different tribes, nations, states, some empires, but they all speak Turkish. And they replaced the Persians, who had been there since before the Greeks, since the time of Mesopotamia. So there's this change in Central Asia over who's the dominant lingual nomadic group. Now, the Byzantines don't know any of that. In fact, even the Arabs don't really know what's going on. And the Turks are these nomadic horse people who are brought in to aid in a side of an Abbasid Caliphate civil war. The Abbasids have a civil war between brothers, and one of them turns to mercenaries. They turn to the horse people of Central Asia and go, hey, I'll pay you good money if you come and work for me. And they say, great, that's fine. And so he brings them in, thousands of Turkish horse people who are so good at war, they easily win the civil war. And then they turn to the Abbasid Caliphate and say, kind of like the Terminators do, or the Matrix, why am I listening to you? Why would I get paid by you when I could just take your money? You can't stop me. And so they took over the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, they can't run it. So it doesn't become a Turkish caliphate. It still remains the Abbasid Caliphate till 1258 when the Mongols come through. But the Turks are now the military. The Turks are now basically telling the Caliph what to do. The Caliph becomes this figurehead. And so they're tough, they're dangerous, they're kind of barely Muslim. Like, they're not that impressed by Islam. Islam's got some cool things going on, sure, right? It's a warrior. It is a warrior religion, so there's that. It's got jihad. But the Abbasids aren't that impressive to the Turks. The Abbasids are very impressive culturally, but by this point, around the 1000 AD, the Abbasids from the 700s have kind of fallen on hard times. So so the Turks have become Muslim, but they're not deeply Muslim. They're not the Arabs. And they're looking for a homeland that looks like Central Asia. See, the problem with Mesopotamia is it's 2 rivers and a lot of desert. They can't settle in Persia. There's too many Persians. That land has already been claimed. They can't push the Persians. They can defeat the Persians in war. They can't occupy, colonize, take over Persia. They can't push the Persians out. There's just not enough Turks. It turns out, though, Asia Minor, Anatolia, the central plain, the central plateau of Asia Minor, looks just like Central Asia. It has the same weather patterns. It looks and acts and feels like home. Now, the coast of Asia Minor is all the French Riviera, the Italian Riviera. It's Mediterranean. It's the Greek islands, right? But the coast leads right to mountains pretty quickly and high plateau. And that high plateau is separated by those mountains on the edge, kind of like how New Jersey is separated from Pennsylvania, how even Philadelphia is a bit separated from Pennsylvania by the mountains. And you could see how New Jersey gets different weather. Like it's snowing in Allentown, and it's either clear or maybe a little rain in Jersey. Right? That's Asia Minor. It's beautiful beach, Riviera, mountains, then high plateau, then Central Asia. And what happens is the Turks come over the mountains, over the Tarsus Mountains that separate Mesopotamia from Asia Minor, and have done that since the age of the Sumerians and the Hittites. And they find Central Asia, and they begin to move in. They say, this looks like home. They call in more friends. They call up in Central Asia more Turkish tribes. Come on in. We found a new homeland. Now, if you're the Byzantine emperor, you can't allow this to happen. Greeks live there. Byzantines live there. There's 1,000 cities and towns that have been there for 1,000 years. And so that leads us to the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. After Basil, we have a series of weak empresses and even weaker emperors. And part of the problem is Basil, I guess, never thought he was going to die. He didn't ready his daughters to lead. He didn't marry them off to men who could lead, nor did he prepare them to lead in their own ability. And so what happened is they became weak, selfish, decadent. They didn't stand up to Basil, and nor did they want men around them who were like their father, this commanding presence, because then that would mean less power for them. And so they hook up with these dilettantes and these just weaker emperors. And so when the Turks invade into Asia Minor, they're not looking just to steal money. They're not looking just to steal horses and leave. They're looking to live, because the interior looks just like Central Asia. And so ironically, this is a great opportunity for the Byzantines. And the Byzantines saw it this way. Why? Because of Natio. Because of that Roman concept that the Byzantines could defeat the Turks, right? Nothing irreversible has happened. These Turkish groups have moved over the mountains out of Mesopotamia, out of the Middle East, into Asia Minor, and they're starting to kind of figure out where to settle. They're beating up Greek-speaking peoples, Greek-speaking Romans that live in the eastern parts, but nothing's permanent. It's like the early Goths. We can defeat these people, convert them to Christianity because they're not really Muslim yet. Because Islam, they defeated Islam. They've taken on Islam for a variety of different reasons. But then they defeated the Caliph. This Muslim God is not that powerful because his representatives on earth are kind of lazy and selfish and decadent. They're weak. So the Turks could be, if you could crush the Turks in a major battle, convert them to Christianity, then you could turn them around and send them across the mountains against the Arabs and reconquer the Middle East. You could reunify the Eastern Roman Christian Empire. The Middle East wasn't yet Islamic. It was maybe 15, 20% Islamic. Not irreversible. Most people who lived in the Middle East, in Syria, in Judea, in Mesopotamia, were still Christians, or Jews, or Zoroastrians in Persia. You still had people who you could bring to the empire. All you had to do was win one big battle, and that battle was decided to be fought at Manzikert. And what happens is a disaster. The Turks win. But why did the Turks win? The Turks win because in the middle of the battle, the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, was betrayed by his own generals. Remember the weak emperors and the weak all this? Well, that went down to the army level too. Because if you're a weak emperor, you don't want strong generals. You certainly don't want a Belisarius out there because he might become emperor. He might replace you. And so the generals were weak and decadent and immoral and not up to the standards of the old Romans. And these generals looked at the emperor and said, hey, if we leave in the middle of the battle, the emperor will go from 100% of his troops down to 30% of his troops. If he goes down to 30% of his troops, he'll lose and he'll be killed, which means Constantinople needs an empire, needs an emperor. And so we could go back and become the emperor. So they betrayed, two generals betrayed their own emperor in the middle of the battle. They left the field. They took their army. They took their troops and left in the middle of the field, in the middle of the battle. The emperor got overwhelmed, as you would expect, and was defeated. Now here's the thing that the generals who are now with their infantry troops walking back to Constantinople forgot or didn't quite appreciate. And that's that the Turks are a nomadic warrior people. Are they going to negotiate with, or are they going to respect commanders, generals, chiefs, leaders who betray their own leader in the middle of a battle? No, there's no chance of that. So while those armies are heading back to Constantinople, the Turks, who are on horseback, catch them and smash those two much smaller armies, and they kill the generals. They destroy the traitor generals. So the Turks are not impressed by the Byzantines or by Christianity. Natio completely fails because they weren't defeated. Not only were they not defeated, the emperor, who fought well, he actually wasn't a bad emperor, the guy who's going to fight at Manzikert. He wasn't the weakest of the weaks. But he's dead. He's useless. He's not impressive. He lost. And He was betrayed by his own men, so he couldn't be that strong of a leader. And so the Byzantines to the Turks just do not look impressive. They betray their own leaders. They betray their own. They have terrible generals. They're just not impressive. So why would the Turks become them? Why would the Turks become Byzantine or Christian? There's no chance. But what happens as a result of this is the major change is what happens to Asia Minor. And that is Asia Minor is completely overrun. Turks start pouring in. The Byzantines have no ability, none, to push them back, to stop them. So what happens is Greek-speaking Christians, Greek Romans start leaving. They flee to the west. They flee to Constantinople. They flee to Greece. They move to a different part of the empire, which opens up the interior for settlement. And so what happens to Asia Minor, what happens to Anatolia, the peninsula, is it goes from being Greek and urban and Christian, Asia Minor, Asia Minor, right? A small part of Asia, which is what the Greeks considered it to be, what the Romans will name it, to being Turkish and rural and Muslim, to being what it is today, Turkey. That's a major change. 1,000 years of Christianity is displaced. This Christianity goes back to St. Paul. There's letters from St. Paul to the Galatians. The Galatians are in Asia Minor, in the interior of Asia Minor. There's 2,000 years of Greek civilization in Asia Minor. We talked about Ionia. We talked about Homer and the Trojan War. That happened in Asia Minor. There's 2,000 years of Greek contact with Asia Minor. And that effectively comes to an end and is replaced by a Turkish, rural, now Muslim society, a world that we call Turkey. Now, there is an attempt. There is a short civil war to figure out who the new Byzantine emperor is going to be, and a guy, Alexei, wins. He doesn't have an army. He doesn't have a good army. He's being pushed by these Turks. And so what he does is he calls up the Pope in Rome and says, can I hire some of your knights? Can I hire some of your heavy horsemen? And the Pope says, I'll get back to you about that. And what the Pope then does is call the First Crusade. Instead of hiring 5,000 mercenaries and then putting them on a boat and sending them to Alexei, which is what he wanted, he calls a crusade and says, if you go to defeat the Turk, Persian, Arab, Muslim, if you go and liberate Jerusalem, you will be forgiven all your sins and get into heaven. Well, what Western Europe then sends is 10 to 15,000 knights, men on horseback who do not take orders, who do not work together as soldiers, who do not fight in the Roman, Eastern, Byzantine, Islamic, Arab way. They fight in this new kind of man on horseback with swords and a lance sort of way. And following them is 50 to 100,000 pilgrims who want to go see Syria, who want to go see Jerusalem, and they figure this is their best chance. The Crusades are a complete disaster for the Byzantines, for Christianity, for the Jews, for Arabs. It's bad for everybody. It's bad for the Crusaders, for most of them. Going to end badly anyway. They're going to carve out states. They're going to carve out little colonial states. But they're not there to save Christianity. They're not there to reconvert the Muslims. They're there to pillage and create new personal empires, which the Byzantines go, wait, that was our territory. And you're not even fighting the Turks, you're fighting the Arabs and the Kurds in the Mesopotamia. Like, don't you know, we need you to fight the Turks here. And the Crusaders are like, no, 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 no. We're going to Jerusalem. We don't care about the Turks. And so the Crusades are just a disaster for everybody involved. In 1204, 200 years after Alexei asks for help, 200 years later, the Fourth Crusade will sack Constantinople. It won't even attack the Muslims. It will attack fellow Christians. So it starts in trauma. It ends in trauma. And there's trauma in the middle. And that is the sad part of the Byzantines. Is there's so much potential. There's so much that maybe the Roman Empire could have been put back together. That Europe as a bunch of individual states didn't have to necessarily happen. Something else could have replaced it. And that thing might have been more authoritarian, but also better educated, more cultural, older, more sophisticated than what will come out. I don't know. But there's the high points of Justinian, of Basil. But there's also just the great missed opportunity. Byzantines to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, to reunite Europe, to reunite the Mediterranean. Now, in our next episode, we're going to deal with Islam. Since Islam is the great winner in this, we're going to talk about Islam. We're going to talk mostly about Arabic Islam, but we'll go into the Mongols show up. So we're going to end in trauma there too. We're going to start in glory, but end in trauma. So be safe, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.